Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and to those tuning in on the West Coast, good morning. My name is Caitlin Donnelly. I am the Program Director for Nonprofit Vote, and this is Redistricting, What It Means, and the Role of Nonprofits. I'm excited to kick off our 2021 webinar series with such an important topic. But before I introduce our guest speakers, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. So first, if you aren't familiar with Nonprofit Vote, we are the nation's largest source of nonpartisan voter engagement resources, including toolkits, fact sheets, original research, and so much more. We exist to help you integrate voter outreach into your ongoing activities and services. Second, this webinar is being recorded, and next week you will receive the webinar recording and slides, so be on the lookout for that. And third, audience participation is what makes these webinars really great. So please use the Q&A box, not the chat box, to send in your questions for our speakers. We'll make sure we answer those at the end. I also have Kimberly Carol Cox on this webinar. She is playing the role of host. So if you have issues, you can chat her directly using the chat box. Today, I want to kick these things off with a poll. So you should see a poll appear up on your screen right now. And we want to know what brings you to the webinar today. Maybe your organization is interested in educating your community about the redistricting process. Perhaps you plan on doing some sort of advocacy around redistricting. Maybe you're like me and know very little about redistricting and are at this webinar to get just a basic understanding of what it is, why it matters to our nonprofit communities. Or maybe you're actually really well versed and you want to find out what other groups are doing. So let us know in the poll. And Kimberly, you can share the results with us when it looks like half or most of our participants have responded to that. Okay, looks like it's really across the board. A lot of you are, here with me wanting to just know more about what is redistricting. And so I think we have some great speakers for you. But for those of you who are already, sure that you want to educate or advocate around this issue, we have some good stuff for you as well. So our agenda for today is really straightforward. We'll start with a presentation by Professor Justin Levitt about the basics of redistricting and how the public can engage in the process. Then we'll hear about how nonprofits in Michigan are planning to educate and engage their communities from Mariana Martinez. And we'll end with our Q&A session. So let's begin. I have the honor of introducing Justin Levitt, Professor of Law at Loyola Law School, a nationally recognized scholar of constitutional law and the law of democracy. Justin's research has been cited extensively in the media and the courts, including the Supreme Court. He maintains the website All About Redistricting, tracking the process of state and federal redistricting around the country, including litigation. So welcome, Justin. I will let you take it from here. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much, Caitlin, and thank you so much to Nonprofit Vote for putting on this webinar. I've had the pleasure of speaking to Nonprofit Vote and to some of the organizations it serves in the past, so I'm really delighted to be back here again. As Caitlin mentioned, I'm a faculty member now, I'm a law professor, but I've come to redistricting through the nonprofit community, through my work before I was an academic at nonprofits. I've also had the privilege of serving in the federal government, in the Department of Justice, including work on redistricting. So I'm not just a ivory tower analyst. I hope that what I'm about to share will be practical and helpful for those of you that want to engage in this really important topic. So I hope to be walking through about 20 minutes of the basics of what redistricting is, and then, as mentioned, turn it over so you can hear about how some nonprofits have engaged on the ground. I will also hope to share my screen because I'll give you something to look at that's better looking than I am, and that is a little bit of a slide template. So with any luck, you're now seeing a Redistricting 101 sidebar. And I really want to approach this from the perspective of fourth grade journalism, just to answer some basic questions. Why do we do it? Who does it? Where do we draw the lines? What is it that you all can do? And when should all of this happen? So let's begin with the first question. Why are we talking about redistricting at all at the moment? So if you are interested in public policy of any kind, and in the nonprofit community, I know that you are all interested in public policy of lots of kinds, then you should be interested in, you are interested in redistricting. Where district lines are drawn determines the representation we receive. Federal office, state office, local office. Anytime we've got elected legislators drawn from district lines, that means where those lines are drawn determine the legislation we get. Racial equity, national security, healthcare, the economy, on and on and on. If you care about any of those things, you care about who our legislators are, and then you care about redistricting. Elections and representation are how we build the world that we want to live in together. And that makes this process incredibly important. Because redistricting is about representation, the basic mandate is to draw districts that are approximately equal in representing people. That means that every time we get new information about how many people live where people have moved, where people have, where population rates have grown or declined, we redraw the district lines. So every 10 years after the decennial census, we update district lines so that the districts are roughly equal in population, making sure that they're roughly equitable in representation. We just had the census, a little more protracted than usual based on the pandemic, but we just had the census in 2020, which is why redistricting is happening now and will continue to happen through this year and into next. Who does this thing called redistricting? Well, in most states, for state legislative line and for congressional line, the legislature has primary control. All of the states here in gray, the legislature is basically in charge. There may be institutions that feed the legislature, that give recommendations to the legislature, or institutions that take over when the legislature fails. But in these states in gray, for state legislative line and for congressional line, the legislature is in the primary driver's seat. And for most city council districts, county commission districts, school board districts, the people who are running in those lines are also in control. That's different from most Western democracies. We tend to let the people with the most at stake in where the lines are draw the lines themselves. This doesn't always happen through the standard legislative process. So for those of you that are used to doing advocacy with your legislature, there may be special rules for redistricting. For example, some jurisdictions have supermajority requirements. In some jurisdictions, the legislature draws the lines without gubernatorial veto possibilities. In other states, there may be special committees or special rules for getting bills out of committee that have to deal with the redistricting process. But this starts in most places with the legislature. In these states, now in gold, either through citizens' initiatives or through the legislative process themselves, the power over the lines is given to some other entity. Often, not always, these entities are more independent commissions, and there may be different points of access to those commissions in each of these different states. Every state is going to be a little bit different in how those rules work. So not all commissions are alike. I'll mention at the very end of this presentation, there's a resource I've got that tracks the process, including all of the institutions that draw the lines for each and every state. So if you want more details on how this works in the states where you're interested, you can find a lot more information about the who and the how on that resource. It's called All About Redistricting, a website. Legislatures aren't the only bodies and commissions aren't the only bodies. The courts also often get involved. This is just from the 2010 cycle. In 36 states, the courts were asked to step into the redistricting process. And in 9 states, they actually ended up drawing the lines for state legislature. In 12 states, they ended up drawing the lines for Congress. So courts can be quite active in this arena. And that's not just federal courts, which may be nonpartisan or more nonpartisan. Some of these courts are state courts, which may be elected along partisan lines. And so it's useful to remember that the courts will be quite heavily involved in redistricting in most parts of the country. What are the rules around where the lines are drawn? These rules are different. There are some rules that are nationwide, rules about equal population. For example, districts have to be roughly equally populated, and that's a constitutional rule for every place in the country. There are rules around race and ethnicity, driven primarily, but not exclusively, around constitutional concerns or around the Voting Rights Act, that also apply across the country. Even with those federal mandates, states may have their own tweaks on where the lines are drawn. So, for example, some states reallocate populations that are incarcerated, making sure that people are represented not where they're incarcerated, but in their home communities where they used to live. Some states similarly have supplemental rules in addition to the Voting Rights Act, either allowing or requiring the states to consider populations of racial minorities or ethnic minorities and giving representation to them. Beyond those basics, which again, baselines for nationally across the entire country and then some states with extras, there are some fairly common criteria in individual states under state law. Some require jurisdictions, some require redistricting institutions to consider municipal boundaries like city boundaries or county boundaries. Some require districts to be more or less compact, that is, relatively close together rather than really stringy and spread out across an entire state. Some have rules about dealing with candidates and parties, about mostly prohibiting unfair partisan gerrymanders or undue partisan gerrymanders, or of drawing districts in order to draw districts around a particular candidate's residence or not. Some states have explicit protection for communities of interest, groups of people with a common interest in legislation, and many of those will be your constituents, the individuals in the communities you serve who have an interest in common legislation, in policy issues. There may be specific state protections for those individuals and the districts that are drawn around them. Every decision in this arena has trade-offs. And I want to emphasize this just because it can be really compelling. It can be a sort of gut instinct to try to rein in the discretion of decision makers so that the lines are more predictable. But if you do that, that's going to make everything else you want to achieve a little bit harder. And watch out for jurisdictions that are tying their own hands. There are lots of different things that you want to take into account when drawing district lines. Maintaining roughly equal population, compensating for potential problems in the census. We all know the census had a rough go of it in 2020. There's been a question in the Q&A on when that census data will come out that allows line drawing in 2021. Some of the delay, I'll talk about in just a minute, has to do with trying to compensate for those problems, but we don't know how many of those problems will be resolved by the Bureau itself. Line drawers may have the opportunity to compensate for census problems, and really tight bounds make that harder. Providing equitable opportunity for minorities, preserving cities or counties or neighborhoods or communities, adjusting the shape of a district, achieving, if that's a goal, political balance. Every single one of those things, if there are really strict limits on how much that particular objective has to be achieved, that makes it harder to do everything else. I also want to note that you should watch out in this process for natural human tendencies to prefer things that are quantitative or that seem clear to things that are ambiguous. It can be very natural to think, well, we might as well just measure the thing that we have that can be measured and leave aside the things that are harder. But that sometimes may violate state law, and it will often lead to results that are suboptimal in the communities that you're advocating for. For example, many provisions of state law require the consideration of communities of interest and also require the consideration of county or city boundaries. County or city boundaries exist on paper. You can see where they are. They're very clear. Communities of interest can be a little more blurry, can be a little fuzzier, but that doesn't mean that the county lines or the city lines are going to be more important than drawing districts that respond to particular solid communities. Watch out for the instinct to give higher priority to the things just because they may be more quantitative or clearer, and lower priorities to things that are actually more important, but may be less susceptible to clarity. Similarly, watch out for the learned human tendencies we have. Many people have preconceived notions about what good looks like, and many of us are familiar about the research on implicit bias, particularly implicit racial bias. This picture represented here, many people will have automatic, not instinctual, but learned notions about which people are good or which people are bad, simply based on racial cues or other human cues that obviously have nothing to do with the individual worth of a person. These are biases that are learned, and the fact that they're learned doesn't make them less powerful. It turns out we have those biases in redistricting as well. If I show you this set of maps, you may automatically have a very strong idea about which of these maps is good and which of these maps is bad. And I'm here to tell you, you don't know yet. Because unless you know what these maps are doing, the instinct you may have based on a map's shape doesn't necessarily communicate how good or bad that district is. One of these lines here is the original gerrymander from 1812. One of these lines is the city of LA. One of these lines is Thailand. Several of these districts were drawn in order to lift up minority communities and give them representation, including representation distinct from other minority communities that live right next door who need their own representation. You can't really know what is good or bad in the redistricting process until you know what a district is doing, not just what it looks like. But this is a very natural tendency in the public to look at shapes in the abstract and then come to conclusions about whether the districts are good or bad. That may be something that you're going to have to fight in the redistricting process in your area. What is it that you can do about any of this? Well, one of the things you can do is you can be prepared to influence the official map drawers. That means advocating in the press for fairer maps, for maps that respond to the communities that you serve. That may mean for some of the nonprofits that have the capacity to do some lobbying, lobbying the official entities, whether that's the legislature or whether that's a independent body or some other commission. It may mean helping to band together to form your own blue ribbon independent body that helps give shape to fairer districts. If there's a legislature, for example, that's bent on drawing districts that are unfair, having a nonpartisan institution that can present alternative maps, draft maps, can sometimes have a real impact on the official legislative process. And then probably most important for most of the organizations on this call, the ability to organize members of the constituents that you have in the communities that you serve to testify, either in front of the legislature or at an independent body, to advocate publicly for lines that respond to their communities. Many redistricting processes, in fact, most redistricting processes, have some opportunity for public input. And you can bet that there will be entities and organizations that see it in their benefit to present their communities as the most important communities in town or in the state or in the region at this sort of testimony. And for your constituents, it may be really important to organize them to prevent a counterweight or to lift up the voices if those are the same communities that you're serving. That testimony can be really important to the official line drawers, but not being naive, it can also be really important when the courts get involved. Keep in mind that courts hate drawing lines, but they are often called on to draw the lines in any given state or in any given county or in any given city. And so to the extent that the work you do to present fairer maps to the original line drawers isn't only advocacy with the original line drawers, it may be extremely persuasive if courts are called upon, either if there's a breakdown in the official process, or if something happens in the official process that is unlawful and the court has to create new maps. The advocacy you do up front may very well go into influencing the lines that are drawn by some decision maker other than the one that you're formally presenting to. So don't discount the impact of all of the work that you may do publicly, both in direct questioning by the line drawers and in advocating in the press. That may well have more of an impact than it might first appear, if not with the initial decision maker, then with some of the courts that might come into play afterward. When does all of this happen? Well, it happens right now, or at least it starts right now, which is part of why Nonprofit Vote is putting together this webinar. Bodies, including legislatures and commissions, are beginning to come into being in the states. Some of them have already been chosen. Others of them are being formed now, either legislative committees or independent bodies. They're beginning to hire staff. They're beginning to hire consultants. They're gearing up. You should be too, whether at the state level or at the county level or at the city level or at the school board level. Now is the time to begin. It's exactly what you're doing with this webinar. Now is the time to begin preparing to engage in the redistricting process. The census, this I know was a question in one of the questions and answers. The census has announced that it will issue apportionment results. That's the total population per state that goes into figuring out how many congressional districts each state has. It's the primary reason for the census. It's the reason the census exists in the Constitution itself. The census will release that data on April 30th. And so on April 30th, we'll know how many congressional seats each state has. September 30th is the date that the census has announced for redistricting data going out to the states, block by block counts of the population, of the racial and ethnic background, of the voting age population, so population of 18 plus. That will be combined with data from surveys that the census has been taking over the last 10 years to get a sense of the citizen voting age population of the electorate. That data will be out by September 30th, but don't wait for that. That's a delay. It's a significant delay off of past years. So in past years, that data has come in mid-February to mid-March. It's been delayed this year in order to try and compensate for some of the problems in the census process to get that information as accurate as possible. That's a good thing, but don't wait for September in order to start engaging in the redistricting process. I have here that maps will begin taking shape in the summer and fall, and that's because many bodies will begin hearing testimony. Texas has already started hearing testimony from communities. Many bodies will begin with a pencil sketch of what the maps might look like from projections based on imperfect data that we have so far. And they will give those maps final shape starting in September, starting in October. But an awful lot will be done to influence the rough contours of where those maps take place now. And so the right time to get engaged is over the coming months, even well before September, in order to make sure that you have the input into what those district lines look like in your communities. Maps will begin being finalized by the end of the year, by the very beginning of 2022, in part because the real drop dead deadline is filing for primaries, for state office, for federal office, for local office in the early months of 2022. Litigation will proceed throughout all of this. That's one constant. That's why the courts are involved. Whether your nonprofit happens to be involved in litigation or not, there are plenty of other opportunities, as I've mentioned, to engage with the process in order to make sure that the initial drafts of maps or the maps created by courts at the back end are as fair as possible. One way that you don't have to wait to get started for the official data is to use projections just to see which areas have grown or shrunk in order to get a sense of where districts will have to get larger or smaller. This is a map of California based solely on estimates of the total population compared to the state average. And already I can see from this map, even before the census data come out officially, that areas in San Diego and in Riverside County have grown. That's the green. Areas in the East Bay of California and in the Central Valley have grown. In contrast, areas around Los Angeles and areas in the northern part of the state have grown less quickly. They've also grown, but less quickly. That means that there are going to be fewer districts in and around LA and in Northern California, and more districts or smaller districts in the areas that have grown. By knowing that, you can get started already on some of the advocacy around district lines that you'll need to engage in the process. Last thing, I mentioned I'd be mentioning a website for more information. I've got a website called All About Redistricting. It tracks the redistricting process, the rules, the timing, the institutions, the criteria in all 50 states. That's my email there. You should also feel free to use that if you have further questions. I know we'll have time for a lot of questions that came up in the Q&A in further discussion. But you may find a lot of the answers to questions you have about state or federal redistricting in particular, about the rules like the Voting Rights Act and other rules about where lines are to be drawn on that website link. Unfortunately, I'm not able to track all of the local redistricting going on in the country. There's just too much of it. That is not, emphatically not, a statement about its importance. Some of the most important lines to be drawn are local lines, particularly given all of the attention paid finally to criminal justice over the summer. We know that local city and county redistricting structures and legislative representation can really make an impact on an immense number of local policies. And so please don't construe the fact that the website doesn't focus on state or on local redistricting as any statement of importance. It is crucially important and one of the places where you all may be able to make the most difference in the policies that your constituents receive. With that, I'll stop sharing my screen. I'll turn this back over to Caitlin and to Mariana, and hopefully we'll save plenty of time for your questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Justin. That was a really helpful overview. Folks can keep putting their questions into the Q&A box. And Justin, if you see questions in there that you think are best responded to with like, oh, here's a link to go find more, feel free to hop in there. We are about to have our next speaker, but I actually wanted to have everyone take a moment. You can use the redistricting site. I'll throw a link and another link to the specific page in a second, but I want to know for everyone who's watching, are you in a state where redistricting around Congress is controlled by the legislature, or is there a commission of some sort in play? So so that map right there will show you that link right there will take you to the map on All About Redistricting site. And I would just, just to make sure you're engaging with this stuff, I want to know legislature state or commission state. And I am located in Massachusetts, so I'm in a legislature state. And Justin, you spoke so much about the census, and Nonprofit Vote did a lot of work around the census, a lot of resources, and for everyone watching, if your organization did anything around the census or had partners engaging in the census, you care about redistricting, and those are your natural allies for getting involved, especially if you think that the process and the count wasn't accurate and you know that a lot of the people you serve might be undercounted. It's even more important that you're really involved in the map drawing to help counteract where that census data might be a little faulty. So folks are starting to throw those in the chat, which is great. So Michigan is one of those states that recently won a hard-fought, citizen-led battle to put control of redistricting in the hands of an unbiased commission. So I'm pleased to introduce Mariana Martinez, who is the Director of Civic Engagement Initiatives at Michigan Nonprofit Association, where she leads statewide initiatives such as the Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission Initiative. Mariana served the office of Detroit City Council member Raquel Castaneda Lopez for 4 years as the chief of staff, where she worked to advance community advocacy and inclusive policy. Welcome, Mariana, and please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Caitlin, and nice to virtually meet everyone. It's very weird to look at a screen and not see your faces, but hopefully things will get back to normal soon. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you guys can see a better image than just my face. So yeah, I live in Michigan, a place where we actually have a redistricting commission. So my hope today is that you walk away with, we'll tell you about our initiative, what we're doing here at the Michigan Nonprofit Association, and hopefully that you leave with some ideas as to how to implement how to do civic engagement as it relates to the redistricting commission. I do have to say some really good important things that I wanted to point out from Justin's presentation. Two things that I like to emphasize is that the census data, yeah, there's a lot of things that are going to change, dates that, depending on the state, but that can complicate the process. However, that doesn't stop us or shouldn't stop us from engaging with communities. The engagement with communities should be happening or should have started happening some time ago. So don't let that deadline or changes disturb the fact that we should be engaging with our communities about the redistricting process. And the second thing, very important, that I thought he mentioned was very important is that weird shapes for maps do not necessarily reflect unfair maps. Weird shapes do not necessarily reflect weird, unfair maps. So that's just something to think about. Some maps do look really weird, but it really is to attempt to keep communities together. So with that being said, I wanted to go ahead and tell you about our initiative here in Michigan, what we're doing with the redistricting. So before that, give you a little bit of a background of how the Michigan Nonprofit Association started getting involved in civic engagement work around important processes like this. We started back in 2017. We started with the Census initiative, and like the census, redistricting happens every 10 years. So it's a very important time that could define a lot of things. If we undercount populations, there could be very important ramifications, negative ramifications for our communities. And so Michigan nonprofit organization, we got involved in a really 3-year initiative or campaign around census to ensure that we reached historically underrepresented communities. We know that there are a lot of communities who are hard to reach for whatever reason. They just don't get counted and therefore don't receive the resources that they need. And so we started back in 2017 with this big campaign that lasted about 3 years. Created hubs, worked statewide to ensure that we reach communities, created materials, videos, it was a multiracial, very, very inclusive campaign to ensure that we reached hard to reach populations. And so with that model, we wanted to essentially replicate it and not let that be or let that end there, knowing that the redistricting process is starting. And so with that, we are doing the same thing, utilizing the same model. We're working with nonprofit organizations to ensure that we reach these communities, specifically underrepresented or historically underrepresented communities. And so we're raising awareness. We're working with different organizations, a cohort of 20 nonprofit organizations in 3 different cities in Michigan. But let me tell you about the process in Michigan. As you heard before, some states as a legislation. In Michigan, in 2018, voters actually voted for proposal number 2, which essentially was removing control of the redistricting process from the legislature or politicians, essentially, to an independent commission. And that was a big step. This is the first time that Michigan is going through that step. So it's a very new process. We're learning from states like California who've done it. Granted, we're adding a layer of the pandemic, which definitely brings challenges, but also brings opportunities in reaching different communities all over the state. And so in 2018, that proposal went or passed by voters, and we elected a commission of voters like you and me. There's 13 randomly selected voters. 4 people represent the Republican Party, 4 represent the Democrat Party, and 5 are not affiliated with any party. And so they started meeting in November of last year. They continue to have meetings, and their job is essentially to redraw the lines, to have, to bring transparency forward and really push democracy, at its core, really is to ensure that the process is transparent, the discussions are, open open and available to the public, that decisions are made with community input and the input of the public. And so that's a very exciting process. We're very excited, but also a little, well, I wouldn't say nervous, but we want to make sure that because this is the first time that we're going through this, that we're doing it, the right way, and that they get the support that they need. So we are helping them into, reaching these communities to ensure that they're hearing from different people throughout the state. And so something that's important to highlight here in Michigan, the third most important criteria, there's a criteria that's important to follow, right, for when redrawing maps. So we have to comply with federal law concerning the Equality in the Voting Rights Act. We have to make sure that districts are geographically contiguous. But most importantly, the third most important component is that states must reflect, districts must reflect the state's diverse population, as well as communities of interest. There are other things, but communities of interest is one of the most important criteria in the process, and I'll explain to you a little bit of what that means. What does that mean? That could mean a lot of things, and that's going to be, I sense, a little bit of a challenge, because it could mean so many things, right? A community of interest may include populations that share cultural or historical characteristics or economic characteristics. So think of what is important in your community. What common beliefs are there? Are there religious groups that are strong in your community? Are there ethnicities or nationalities that are in your communities, age groups, etc.? So there are a lot of things. This is just one portion, but that is something that is the third most important criteria that is in our process, and so we have to ensure that that's elevated and considered. So with our initiative, what M&A is, Michigan Nonprofit Association, short for M&A, is what we're doing is we're mobilizing nonprofits to transparently achieve fair and impartial district maps for Michigan, specifically to promote racial equity. So essentially that communities of color have a voice and are not locked out of important decision-making processes that occur at the local, state, and federal levels. So our goal, it really is to reach communities who are often left out of processes like these through the work with the nonprofit organizations that we're working with, and ensuring that we reach them. So that is at the core of this initiative and the main goal. So really, we wish we could focus on the whole state. Given the resources and the tools that we have now, we had to be laser focused on how many cities and places we could focus on. And so we are working in 3 different cities in Michigan, Detroit, Grand Rapids, and Flint, which is essentially where gerrymandering happens. It's predominant. We know that Michigan is actually one of the states that has the highest levels of gerrymandering, so that's definitely something of concern. And so we decided to work in these cities where there's a lot of underrepresented communities. So we're working with a cohort of 20 nonprofit organizations. And these nonprofit organizations represent a variety of different communities, such as the African American community, the Latino and Hispanic community, the Arab American community, Asian American and Pacific Islanders, Bangla, Caribbean, African. But we're also with leading with inclusivity, we're also working with communities that represent the LGBTQ communities and the people with disabilities. So that is extremely important. And so what we're doing is we are arming them with resources. So very much like many of you, I'm sure you're doing, is creating trainings, right? What is redistricting? Redistricting 101, like the presentation we just saw. It's important to understand what the heck is that? What does that mean? Redistricting is not as sexy as census. I think it is, but it doesn't necessarily resonate with a lot of communities, specifically with communities who have not been part of processes like these. And so we're offering trainings. We're offering trainings on what the process is, what's at stake, why is it important to be involved in this process, but also trainings such as how to engage with the commission, how to provide public comment, how to provide written materials to the commission, and eventually how to draw a map and submit maps ultimately, for sure. And so hopefully today, what I'd like to share with you is we launched our campaign. Actually, yesterday was our press conference officially announcing who we're working with. And with this cohort of 20 nonprofit organizations, they're getting their work started. And hopefully what I'm doing here, what I did here is recap some of the ideas of what they're doing to civically engage with their communities. With the resources and the trainings that we're giving them, they are in turn disseminating that information to their communities. And they are getting started. And the ingenuity of a lot of these nonprofit organizations, I was just like in awe to hear. And so what I did here was I recapped and compiled a list of the things that they're doing, and hopefully you can take away some of these ideas. Some of the things, they're doing a lot of traditional things, right? Oh, traditional in our new normal, really. Virtual town halls and webinars to offer these trainings, right? What's redistricting, how to do these things, why is it important? We're translating, that's also very important to mention, the translation of materials into the languages of your communities is really, really important. Hearing the message, even from community leaders, is not enough, but you need to ensure that the messages are translated so that the message resonates differently when you're being inclusive. And also something that we're doing is partnering, or nonprofits rather, is partnering with community leaders. It's not enough to have an executive director, right? They are recognized in their communities, but community leaders need to be part of that so that the message is stronger. And so virtual town halls are doing it via virtual town halls, webinars. They're creating community videos with community leaders, as I mentioned, in different languages, especially if, say, your community has, in Detroit, there's a large community, African community, and so we're going to be working on translating materials or videos like Redistricting 101, what is that and why that's important, into the local languages. They're doing social media campaigns, they're doing Facebook Live sessions. Some people are really reactive or rather active on Facebook, and so those work very well. Some of them are doing phone banking, some of them are doing partnering with local radio stations, especially ethnic media is really important to reach ethnic media. If in your community is, it's a diverse community, I'm sure there is some kind of immigrant community, so it's important to perhaps connect with them. And so that's something we're doing. They're also doing texting campaigns, which I think is great. WhatsApp chain messages for a lot of immigrant communities. That's one of the main ways how they communicate, how they pass messages. And so that's a great idea that I thought was very innovative and definitely effective to pass this message. They're doing telethon halls rather. They're also doing podcasts. So that's to the extent of their abilities in technology available, but some of them are doing that. Others are incorporating the redistricting education and awareness along with some of the activities that they're doing, such as canvassing. I know right now it's winter in Michigan. If you've ever been in Michigan, you'll know how cold it gets here. So that's going to be closer to when it gets warmer. But canvassing is something that is very important to consider for especially the digitally divide communities, or if you have communities that have a lot of, it's predominantly seniors. That's very important to reach them via phone banking or phone, because that's often how they a good connection. But door to door is something that, obviously with the necessary precautions and social distancing, but it's something that some of our nonprofits are definitely doing because it's crucial for those, like I mentioned, who are not connected digitally the way you and I are. Some of them are going to be doing map contests at parks, again with social distancing requirements and precautions, but they're going to be, gathering at parks and figuring out how to draw a map in person at parks. Some of them are distributing or handing out flyers at food distribution centers. And again, those are some of the things that they're doing already that they're incorporating in their activities that are happening. And then some things that you probably have done or have thought about doing is participating in blog club meetings. These happen often, perhaps once a month. So joining them to get, maybe 15 minutes in the agenda and telling them about redistricting and inviting them to any, trainings is something that they're doing. Joining coffee hours with local or state representatives. They often have, coffee hours or, town halls themselves. And so it's important. Some of them are what they're doing is partnering with them. Some of them are attending school district activities. That's also something really important. They're parenting meetings where, it's a really great pipeline of communication to get to people and pass the message. So some of them are doing that. One that I thought was really original was they offer health and wellness activities already. And I think they had a monthly activity, and one of them was a cooking lesson. So they're going to be doing cooking lessons and talk about redistricting. So I thought that was really original and throw it out there in case that's, they really are thinking about it all and how to catch people's attention, because like I mentioned, redistricting is not as easy to explain and especially easy to understand what, it's easy to say how to participate, but to really explain what the process is, it takes sometimes like, let me catch your attention or give, do something original so that you attend. And I feel, okay, so other organizations, what they're doing is they're creating a QR code that would lead people to surveys. And that's a great way to get a sense of what communities are thinking. So they're gathering different kinds of information, like what kinds of trainings or what kinds of things would you like to hear, or how would you like this information to be disseminated. So that's a great way to obtain input and to be responsive to what the community needs and how to deliver this message so that it resonates and it goes through. Others are organizing virtual trivia sessions. I thought that was great. So creating some questions and then creating sessions to make it fun and not, boring, because it could also be very boring explaining what redistricting is, let's be honest. Others are giving raffle tickets to those who provide public comments. So in their meetings with their constituencies, they encourage people to participate, but it doesn't stop there. Like, how do we incentivize people? They're doing raffle tickets. So I thought that was a great idea that I threw out there. And then something to really take into consideration, creating culturally appropriate events, such as if your community has, I don't know, minorities where that needs to be considered, think of offering different sessions that for women only, for example. So culturally appropriateness is really important to take into consideration in the way you're engaging with your communities. Others are also doing pre-recorded messages. So some of the videos that are going to be created, but they're disseminating these messages at mosques or at their religious gatherings. So I thought that was a great idea. And some of them are specifically engaging with youth. So I thought some of the ideas were great. Some of them are doing TikTok videos. We know TikTok really catches the attention of a lot of people. And I mean, I love TikTok. I will say it's my guilt pleasure. But it could be it's a fun way to educate and to provide pertinent information that could, if it goes viral, then that's great for us. And so some of them are doing that. Others are joining literally classes like history or dance classes to provide information and make it interactive, right? For youth to participate. And another organization is actually attending basketball games, but they are for those where that is possible, actually. But what they're doing is they're letting the youth play first, and then they're going to implement the redistricting conversation. So and the reasoning for that was they need to get their anger out and all the energy so that then they can focus 100% on what redistricting is. And so hopefully that gives you some ideas as to what is our nonprofit, a cohort of nonprofit organizations are doing. We just launched this initiative. We starting literally, we announced it yesterday, and the work is getting started. But like I mentioned, it should be, the work needs to start now. We don't have to wait for, there are a lot of things that could change deadlines, et cetera. For Michigan specifically, November 1st is the deadline, but I'm sure that's going to change now that the census data won't be available, or it will be available very, very soon before that. And so the time to engage with communities is now. You don't have to wait until that happens. I think that we have to build those conversations. It's not enough to just say, well, here's redistricting, right? There has to be an aggregation of conversations or buildup of conversations, especially so that not only our communities know what redistricting is, but how to participate. Is not one conversation might not be enough. It might be a set of different conversations, and it needs to happen over time. And so the time for that is now. And so hopefully I gave you some innovative ideas so that you can take home, and happy to answer any questions regarding what our nonprofit organizations are doing, and happy to provide updates as things develop. Since this is the beginning, these are just the beginning of some of the ideas that some of them are already implementing, but I'm sure as time moves on, and with things opening up more, with the pandemic, I am sure that ideas are going to come up more later on. But so, yeah, with that, I will return the virtual mic to Caitlin and take some questions.
Thank you so much, Mariana. I asked you for examples of what nonprofits are doing, and you delivered. Make sure you send those slides to me, because I'm sure everyone on the call wants to review that awesome list that you have. We do have a ton of questions. I'm going to give you a chance to catch your breath, Mariana, and pose a couple to Justin. So the first question that I want to get to, how do you factor for equitable opportunities for minorities into the redistricting equation? What and how is data used?
So a really good question. There are federal protections, pardon me, in the Voting Rights Act. I get emotional. No, I'm just getting choked up. There are federal protections in the Voting Rights Act that apply when groups of minorities are large and when there are polarized voting patterns. So a particular minority group tends to vote differently from other members of the population. But beyond that, and this is the really important thing, institutions and jurisdictions can consider communities, including, as Mariana said, communities with common cultural heritage, common historical concerns, common access to social institutions. And some of those will, as we all know, revolve around race and ethnicity. So even beyond the federal requirements of the Voting Rights Act, which is complicated and takes more time than I've got here to explain, though you can find a lot more information on the All About Redistricting page and elsewhere. Jurisdictions can consider communities of interest around race and ethnicity. The one thing that they should make sure is that they're also considering other things at the same time. But you may sometimes hear that jurisdictions aren't allowed to consider race or allowed to consider ethnicity or allowed to consider racial equity. That's nonsense. There's no state in the country that does that. You just have to be a little bit careful about the how, but building the sort of community input from communities of color can be really, really important to making sure that the representation they get at the end of the day is fair.
Thank you. Mariana, I'll throw this one to you. I think this is a great question. How do you manage developing input to preserve communities of interest while keeping partisanship out of it? That's a big one for our 501c3s.
Yes, that's a great question. We're nonpartisan, and we have to make sure, we went into this initiative for us orbiting around civic engagement, and we often get the questions, well, what's a fair map, right? For us, a fair map means civic engagement or participation from communities. And so for us, it's meeting communities where they are. hearing where they, what, like giving them the resources, but it's not up to us. It's not up to Michigan, Michigan M&A or Michigan Nonprofit Association to decide. And even the nonprofit organizations that we're working with, they might have a vision that they want to endorse. It really is not up to them or us. It really is the community. So for us, is the community, what is the voice of the community that we're orbiting around this initiative? And so that's what we're leading with. That really leaves the political problems or the politicized process that this has been really is out for us, is meeting communities where they are, giving them the resources and leaving that out. So civic engagement and community participation is the most important for us. So hopefully I answer your question.
I think so. And I think just as when you're doing voter engagement activities, it's always good to remind the, people during the event that you're a nonpartisan organization. Conversations may dive into partisan territory, and that's okay as long as you're really clear that you're a nonpartisan organization and anyone representing your organization keeps that nonpartisan framework and helps pull it back to that nonpartisan lens, even if it does sort of end up getting into a more partisan territory.
Exactly.
We have lots more questions. Justin said he'd be able to stick around for a bit. Mariana, do you have a hard stop?
I don't. I can stay for a little bit longer, yeah.
Okay, great. So we might stay for another, 10 minutes past the hour, but I know everyone has a very busy schedule. But Justin, I'm wondering, can you tell us what unlawful aspects are there to look for and object to?
Depends on where you live. So there are a couple rules that are national about roughly equal population, not really important, not exactly equal. Making population exactly equal in each district is one of those things that ties your hands and makes things harder to do all of the other things you might want, making sure the maps are fair for communities and for minority voters and for keeping district lines together, city lines together, things like that. Roughly equal population, though, that's a national mandate. The Federal Voting Rights Act is a national mandate. But beyond that, the rules really vary by state and in local jurisdictions by locality. You can find all of the criteria, the legal criteria that are used to assess maps at the state level on my website, all about redistricting. And many of those same things also apply at the local level, but it'll depend on the particular, sometimes state law and sometimes local municipal ordinances about what the rules are that local jurisdictions have to follow.
Great, thank you. And Mariana, I can't remember if you addressed this, but somebody asked how could they get involved in any of the Michigan activities happening?
Yeah, that's a great question. So thank you. We are working with the cohort, a cohort of 20 nonprofit organizations. It is listed on our website. So if you go to our website, www.mnaonline.org, you should be able to see the list of the cohort. Know that the work doesn't stop with the cohort itself, because they themselves are partnering with not only amongst themselves, but also with other organizations. And so that's a great way to either contact myself or the cohort. And that's, the activities, like I mentioned, all of the list that I provided it's a list of the activities that all of these organizations are doing. If there's one particular that you were interested, that I mentioned that you're interested, I can connect you directly with the organization that's doing that. But that's one way to get involved.
Great. Oh, here's a good one for Justin. Have there ever been efforts to use computers to draw district lines so as to remove human biases and political incentives and achieve maximum fairness?
Yeah, watch out for those. I will say, so this comes up repeatedly, and you will hear in every cycle people saying, why don't we just let the computers do it? And my answer to that is, we could also just let the computers come up with a fair tax system. Now, actually, it turns out that redistricting is harder as a mathematical problem than letting the computers come up with a fair tax system. It turns out to be really, really difficult. But even if it were possible, there's nothing a computer can do to tell you what's fair, just like in a tax system. There's a lot of value judgments that go into that. And even the choice to choose voters at random and put them into a district is a choice. And that choice is saying that communities aren't important, city bounds aren't important, that minority communities of color aren't important. So whoever's programming the computer will be telling you what's fair. And that can be a real problem. In contrast, I actually really like systems like Michigan's that set out an independent body to draw the lines so that people don't have in particular conflicts of their own, give them some guidance to try and hash out what's fair, but do that in a way that's very human, that takes into account really human factors like which communities should be represented, which communities should have voice, how do we make sure that minority communities aren't squelched in that process. All of that is actually much more easily done by people hashing out what they think is fair in a representative way and without conflict than it is drawing using a computer. Every time you see somebody proposing using a computer to draw the lines, not to evaluate the lines that have been drawn, there are ways that computers can do that in a really helpful fashion, but to actually draw the lines themselves, you're usually seeing abstract geometry at work rather than people. And redistricting is really about representing people and not pretty looking shapes on a grid.
Absolutely. I remember being involved in a process to find a more fair and equitable way to assign students in Boston public schools to their schools. And they brought in a lot of MIT folks who built all these cool algorithms. And in the end, communities actually didn't feel very comfortable with what they came up with because the algorithm didn't understand the communities. So it's good to generate ideas, but the human interaction and input, I think, is so important. And there are so many places where, this can happen. So we have a question that I hope you can answer, Mariana. Any suggestions for specific programs that public libraries could host?
Ooh, that's a good question. I'm not sure I can answer that. No, I'll take, that's a good idea, actually. But I will research and certainly will get back to you.
Probably good to
Okay.
start with just finding out who is involved in redistricting effort.
Right.
And inviting in volunteers to host some programming. I know all our librarians across the country have a lot on their plates right now in our new virtual environment.
Yeah. Caitlin, there's a question that I was just reading, and I think it might be important to mention if it's okay.
Sure, we have a lot. So if you have one that you like, jump in.
No, I just happened to read, how to discuss redistricting with or without the word gerrymandering. I think that's a great question, especially for, we're nonpartisan, and that's at the forefront of how we're leading our work. But we are explaining what gerrymandering. I think it's important that the concept itself, it's important to understand. It's the why voters voted, or we voted really in Michigan to change the process from a legislative, process to citizens. There's a reason, right? There is gerrymandering. So I think it's not. I don't want to. Or maybe demystifying the word and explaining it is important. I wouldn't shy away from talking about it as if could that be controversial? Perhaps, but I think it's important. Explaining the concept is important. We've included it very much in our training so that they make, why is this change? Why is transparency important, et cetera. So without pointing fingers or saying what party, how that's been, the process, just explaining the process has been very helpful, and why we created a commission. It's important. So I would not shy away from explaining what that concept is and how that's influenced your state or the process in your state.
Right, and gerrymandering is really a bipartisan
right, exactly,
game. So this question, Justin, maybe you can start, but Mariana, you might have a Michigan-specific lens. Will the public see draft maps and proposals during the process, or is all the advocacy effort aimed just at pushing ideas before the map comes out? And you also mentioned Justin, legislation after, or litigation after the maps have started to be drawn?
So I think in part that depends on where you live, but in part it depends on you. So if people demand transparency into the process, sometimes they can get it. But just like any advocacy effort, that really depends on people making sure that their voices are heard, that they want to see drafts, that they want to see some of what the legislators are thinking. In traditional legislatures, often that process has been behind closed doors. The map emerges one day and everybody just has to like it. But the more advocacy there is around the process up front, the more chance there is that you'll be able to affect not only where the maps are drawn, but what you can see about how the maps are drawn in the process. I'll also say citizens seeking constitutional change and state legislative change like they did in Michigan. So in Michigan, when the citizens created change to the existing legislative process, they did it with a lot more transparency. And that is typical across the country, that when citizens are in control of what the process looks like, they build more transparency in because they want to be able to see what drafts are. You can also, in your communities, produce your own draft maps to use as examples. And even if the legislature that may be in charge decides to ignore them, they may be really impactful with courts. And I want to emphasize this, you don't always have to draw a full statewide map in order to have impact. Being able to delineate the bounds of a particular community, particularly when those can otherwise be a little fuzzy, can be immensely helpful to line drawers, both the official ones and the courts later on, in order to know how to draw the lines to serve the communities that you are engaged with. So just the ability to pull up on Google Maps or on an old-fashioned road atlas on a road map to show, here's where my people are, please keep this community together, can be really important advocacy. It's really underrated for those organizations to think, I don't have the resources to do a whole statewide map. You don't have to.
Yeah, that's great, great response. In Michigan, so what we're doing, what the commission is charged to do is essentially offer a town hall for public comment, 10 actually by law, prior to drawing the maps. Then they're going to hopefully hear the community, draw the maps, and then they're going to hold 5 more meetings to then show the maps to the community. And hopefully in that process, right, and our job is to engage people before, so that they hear from communities on not only what's communities of interest or what's important in the community, but hopefully maps, right? But most importantly, once the maps are shown, or once the commission makes the maps and shows them to the community, that's probably the most important, because they may or may not have taken into consideration public input. And so our job with the cohort, and hopefully the cohort will increase depending on our ability to fundraise more money, will be to build those conversations, right? And to the extent possible, create those different communities. And like I mentioned, there may be communities that have different views, but to what extent we can unify a vision and come to a consensus of what a fair map looks like, even if it doesn't mean, even if it means some kind of compromising in what that fair map looks like for those 2 different communities that are very close together. To give an example. And so the work for us is to ensure that people provide that, whether it's giving maps or submitting maps. We're using platforms like Representable, and with that we're also working with statewide partners. We're doing the same thing because it's important not to work in silos, figure out who else is doing what you're doing so that the community is hearing the same sort of message, whether it's you or someone else. And so platforms like Representable help you look at what's a community of interest, what's important. There are many others that I'm happy to share, but that's the one that we're working with. And to the extent possible, unify that message, so that communities provide more concise information to the commission. And so that's what we're doing, and I think hopefully it'll be helpful. We'll see.
Yeah. And for anyone really interested in the transparency aspect of this, I would recommend looking into Campaign Legal Center. I went to their webinar last week. That was awesome, about ethics in redistricting and like how to make sure it's an ethical, fair, and transparent process, because it's not a sexy one, as Mariana mentioned. So sometimes, it's easy for it to just happen behind closed doors because that's easier, but you want to make sure that you can see those maps, that it's covered by Freedom of Information Act laws, etc. I want to end with a question that Justin, you marked as one you could answer. So for everyone who's still out there, what do you suggest for information regarding local redistricting?
Yeah, there were a ton of questions along these lines in the Q&A, and thank you for asking them all. A lot of them focused on DC, but I know there are plenty of people who are working on municipal redistricting, county commission, city redistricting across the country, wherever you may be. Those are incredibly important. And this may be a way to get the public libraries involved, to have a callback to a prior question. So a lot of the rules that local cities have to follow will be similar in structure to the rules that states have to follow. So if you want general information on the sorts of things that cities or counties may be dealing with, the All About Redistricting website can help you get a handle on some of those basic rules. But to really dig into what the specific rules are in particular jurisdictions, it's the same place you get information about local municipal rules all the time, either a county charter or rules in state law about home rule or about how a county does its process, or the county or city website, which will often have information about redistricting that's coming up. You can keep track of what's going on through county hearings or city council meetings, and some of you are engaged in all of those things on a regular. You'll start hearing them talk about the need to draw district lines as the year comes up, and that's the simple best way of getting plugged into information about local redistricting. Is the way to get plugged into information about local policy generally, and that's to be engaged with all the same local sources that you all already know how to find. Local libraries are really great resources for pulling together information materials on the rules for the districting process in that area. And so that may be a way to encourage local civic institutions that really are all about public education to help getting involved in connection with you and your organizations and the communities you serve.
Thank you, Justin. I think that is a great note for us to wrap up on. Thank you, Mariana. You both gave us so much insight, information, a lot of great stuff that we can carry forth with us in our redistricting work. As a reminder, everyone will get the recording and slides sent to your email next week. We'll also include a link in there for our next webinar, which will be about our America Goes to the Polls report. So redistricting can mean more competition, better competition, which drives turnout. But there's a lot of other policies that drive turnout as well. So join us next month, March 11th, for that. And in the meantime, please take our survey, which should open up at the once you close this window. It's really helpful for us to have that feedback and plan more great webinars for you all. So thank you and enjoy your Thursday.